Hello, everyone. My name is Ava Susanne Taylor, and I'm a senior business major at Meredith College. Today, I'll be presenting my honors thesis on challenges impacting small-scale producers in North Carolina's seafood industry. Before we get started, I'd like to explain why I chose my topic. I'm very passionate about the interests of commercial fishermen because my family has owned and operated a wholesale seafood business in Sea Level, North Carolina for over 80 years. My great-grandfather started the business in 1937, and it is now where my grandparents, my father, and my two uncles work. You can even find me there in the summertime. While this is a very personal topic, I believe everyone should be knowledgeable about the seafood industry because it is a primary food source for our nation and our world. An outline of what we're going to discuss: the economic, historical, and cultural importance of the industry with specifics to Carteret County, challenges within the industry, consumer preference and education, and suggestions for improvement. Methods used include data analysis of economic reports and published statistics, literary analysis of political and historical articles, and interviews with fishery experts. Fishing runs strong in the veins of North Carolinians, specifically those in coastal communities. There are 19 counties that make up North Carolina's coastline, and each of these counties registers some sort of economic contribution from commercial fishing. The 5 counties of Carteret, Dare, Hyde, Beaufort, and Pamlico made up over 80% of the state's seafood landings between 1994 and 2012. This chart shows you the top 5 producing counties and their values from that time. Across North Carolina, the industry contributed an estimated $116 million of economic impact, $51 million of income, and nearly 3,500 full and part-time jobs in 2012. It's important to note that these statistics only account for the harvesting sector of the industry, meaning the value of the catch when it reaches the dock. There's a great deal of economic activity that goes unaccounted for between retailers, wholesalers, restaurants. Seafood kept for personal consumption and interstate commerce are also excluded from these statistics. The seafood must pass through many hands before it ever reaches a consumer's plate, and each step down the supply chain adds its own valuable contributions. Having no way to track this is disadvantageous because it underestimates the overall impact the industry has on North Carolina's economy. It's also important to note that the industry creates a rippling effect into other markets, such as tourism, boat building and repair, restaurant sales, just to name a few. This rippling effect also makes the industry more impactful than most people realize. Cultural and historical importance. The first recorded European contact with North Carolina was in present-day Carteret County, and it was in the early 1520s. Until the 1920s, this same area was still nearly entirely isolated because boats were the only means of transportation. That means for nearly 400 years, you had communities that were entirely dependent on the water or the land for a means of survival. This crafted an entire community culture and heritage that still remains today. Most people who currently live in the area have deep family roots and ties to the community. These shared traditions create a bond that can only be felt, not explained. However, people from all walks of life enjoy seafood, not just those who live at the coast. In fact, people are eating more seafood than ever. The United States per capita consumption has increased over 71% from 1961 to 2017. This sounds like a win for commercial fishermen, yet there's been a consistent decline in overall state landings between 1999 and 2019. There's been over a 65% decrease, which comes out to over a 100 million pound reduction. You may ask, how does this work? How are people eating more seafood if less seafood is being harvested? This introduces us to two of the biggest challenges facing fishermen: government regulation and imported seafood, which work together in a vicious cycle. Government regulation controls and lowers the supply. With a lower supply yet rising demand, prices are increased. With this higher price, many consumers turn to the cheaper alternative of imported seafood. Now that you've been introduced to the challenges, let's dive a little deeper. In efforts to keep water sustainable, There's a multitude of regulatory agencies commercial fishermen must abide by. Each one of these agencies have the jurisdiction to provide rules and regulations that fishermen are legally required to follow. The biggest one for North Carolina fishermen is the Division of Marine Fisheries. This agency handles all of the licensing and registration for fishermen, and here are some examples of different licenses they may be required to hold. They also handle proclamations, which are the rules and regulations themselves. These come in the form of size limits, quotas, gear restrictions, location restrictions, and harvesting seasons. Basically, proclamations tell you what you can catch, how you can catch it, when and where you can catch it. Many fishermen feel that government regulation is causing the slow and painful death for the industry, and it's only getting worse. There's been an increase in the number of marine fisheries proclamations issued within the last several years. Not only does this hurt fishermen, but it can also create an adverse impact on the environment. Instead of having a diverse set of fisheries, fishermen are being forced to compete for the same species, putting more pressure on that ecosystem. These regulations are made in the name of preservation, yet by making certain species off limits, it only results in the overfishing of what is allowed. There's a common misconception that fishermen don't support regulation, and that simply is not true. This notion is illogical. Fishermen have more reason to protect the resource than those who fish for fun. In fact, fishermen have even worked with scientists to show their support of responsible science-based management. However, most fishermen have no faith in regulatory agencies treating them fairly. This is because many of the decisions made by these agencies are influenced by politics and special interest groups, the most widely known one being the Coastal Conservation Association. The CCA fights for recreational anglers' interests and presents a conflict between the allocation of resources between those who fish for fun and those who fish for work. It's a nonprofit organization that was founded in the 1970s out of Houston, Texas, because wealthy sport anglers thought that commercial fishermen were killing sports fishing in their local bays. It now has a presence in 17 different states and has a large influence over North Carolina's industry. The CCA has succeeded in reducing quotas of fish allotted to commercial interests, removing entire species of fish from commercial harvest, banning the use of certain equipment, shortening harvesting seasons, and having a strong influence over regulatory agencies and state legislators. In his book, Wetland Riders, Robert Fritchie discusses the conflict between sport fishermen and commercial fishermen. He claims, the CCA has nothing to do with conservation unless you consider sport fishermen having all of a certain species allocated to themselves as conservation. In his book, he also makes sure to distinguish between the average recreational fisherman and the extremely wealthy anglers who are the financial backbone for special interest groups like the CCA. It's these high net worth individuals who are the biggest threat to commercial interests because they're able to donate to political campaigns and establish allies in bureaucratic agencies. Many fishermen feel like they're fighting a losing battle, and you can't blame them. The North Carolina Fisheries Association is a nonprofit organization that promotes commercial interests. In this 2018 revenue comparison, you see that the Fisheries Association brought in a little over $300,000 of revenue, whereas the CCA brought in over $11.8 million of revenue. It's clear to see which one of these organizations would have a greater influence over legislative policy. The CCA also has sponsorships from very successful businesses like Costa, Salt Life, West Marine, Yeti, Yamaha, just to name a few. Fishermen are faced with these never-ending biased regulatory policies and large corporations being able to promote the agenda of their opposition. If that's not enough, fishermen also have to ward off the villainized view that the public has formed through misinformation and assumptions that fishermen want to deplete waterways when nothing could be further from the truth. This negative public view only worsens as coastal communities face greater waterfront development. North Carolina's coast is a very popular vacation and retirement destination, which causes an influx of seasonal and permanent residents to the area. While these tourists and second homeowners positively impact local economies, there are some drawbacks. Tourists who are buying up pricey waterfront acreage don't want to look at or live next to non-aesthetic fish houses. We're also seeing a shift of community cultures from quaint fishing villages to the next generic tourist trap. This waterfront development also increases property value, which in turn increases property taxes, applying more pressure to already financially strapped fishing families and fish house owners. Some fish house owners who recognize the downturn in the industry think that it's smarter to sell off their property while they have the chance. Increased waterfront development is leading to a decrease in working waterfronts. This hurts the industry by throwing a kink in the supply chain. In most cases, the supply chain flows from fisherman to fish house, then to the wholesaler, retailer, restaurant, and then to the consumer. Fish houses and watermen are dependent on one another, so much so that North Carolina has begun to offer tax incentives to keep working waterfronts viable. People are quick to jump the gun on blaming fishermen for environmental problems, but are reluctant to see how development and tourism can also make negative impacts on the environment. New constructions of condos, hotels, and massive beach houses border the same designated nursery areas that are off limits to fishermen. This introduces issues such as chemical runoff and large septic systems that add pressure to the ecosystem. The influx of tourism also brings in more general waste like plastic and cans left on the beaches. Tourists bring their boats, adding more water pollution. They drive their cars, adding more air pollution. They bring their fishing rods to claim their portion of marine resources. This view is hardly ever explored when discussing environmental protection. That's because, most importantly, tourists bring their money, making it more convenient for blame to be laid at the feet of commercial fishermen. Briefly mentioned earlier, consumers often turn to imported seafood because of its lower price and usually it's more readily available. Over 80% of the seafood consumed in the United States is imported. Although this is convenient to consumers, it's detrimental to the commercial industry. There have been lawsuits seeking reparations for domestic shrimpers because many of these importing practices violate United States trade laws. These lawsuits have ruled in favor of domestic shrimpers, and with their rulings, it proves that these practices are hurtful. There have been job losses, business closures, and the loss of economic activity because of these importing practices. Instead of revitalizing our domestic industry, we've been investing in foreign shrimp production. The World Bank has given over $8.9 billion in subsidies, and the United States government has given over $1 billion in assistance to third world shrimp producing countries. This foreign aid is often made in the name of assisting them, yet research shows that these shrimp farms actually are more hurtful to their community and their environment than it is helpful. One of the most powerful arguments against imported seafood is its lack of quality control. Shrimp farms grow their product in either shallow man-made ponds or industrial-sized tanks where thousands upon thousands of shrimp inhabit the same area. This allows fecal matter, chemicals, and excess food to build up and decay, prompting disease to set in. Farmers then use drugs or other chemicals to fight off disease and maintain high production levels, and this can remain on the shrimp. They often use antibiotics, and antibiotics are not approved by the United States for shrimp farming purposes, and it is illegal to import shrimp that have been raised on antibiotics. It's considered a public health risk. It's the FDA's responsibility to monitor and stop contaminated seafood from entering our country. There are rules and regulations, but enforcement is very limited. In 2014, the FDA tested less than 1% of shrimp imports. In a study conducted by Consumer Reports Food Safety and Sustainability Center, 40% of their raw farmed shrimp samples had antibiotics on them, and 60% had bacteria. The FDA is failing its people by allowing these chemical-packed products to enter the country. A North Carolina fisherman can be stopped at any time during his trip to have his catch inspected. The officer can board their vessel and inspect their catch to make sure that all the rules are being followed. There should be even more adamance about regulating imported seafood, but there's clearly a shortfall. The fact that fresh local seafood is heavily regulated, but there are lax regulations on imported seafood is a mystery that's difficult to fathom. Consumer preference and education. These are of the utmost importance regarding quality difference between imported and domestic seafood. Research shows that consumers prefer fresh local seafood when they are given the choice between it and imported, and many are willing to pay a higher price. This is because they know the benefits of fresh seafood. Buying locally gives consumers the chance to know exactly where their food comes from. They're able to put a face to their product. The supply chain for local fishermen is much smaller than imported seafood, causing a smaller carbon footprint. Imported seafood has to make its around-the-world trek before it ever reaches the consumer, causing more environmental damage. Local fishermen also have a larger variety of choices than supermarkets, and they offer a healthy food option without the harmful additives often found in imported seafood. There's a desperate need for the public to be educated about the challenges facing the industry. If these conditions hold or follow the same disheartening path, there is a possibility of a global fisheries collapse by the year 2048. Now more than ever, fishermen need to strengthen their position and make their voices heard. This is happening at a very unfortunate time, a time when many fishermen are leaving the profession. We've seen almost a 35% decrease in the purchase of standard commercial fishing license between 2000 and 2019. We're witnessing a graying of the fleet, an occurrence where older fishermen are leaving the industry without a younger generation to replenish. Commercial fishing has always been a taxing way of life, but there was room for financial reward. This financial reward has diminished under the stress of industry obstacles, and we're left with the stinging fact that it's hard to support a family on a fishing income alone. This explains the trend in less full-time fishermen and more part-time fishermen, because watermen are forced to get jobs in other marine trade opportunities like ferries or tugboats. Suggestions for improvement. Fishermen need to improve their marketing strategies by hopping on the nationwide shop local and buy organic movement. This gives them the opportunity to market their product based on its competitive advantage, its higher quality. It also allows consumers to put a face to the product, which gives an element of consumer satisfaction that cannot be achieved through buying imported seafood. The commercial industry needs to recognize, promote, and capitalize this advantage. The fishing community should also encourage the development of organizations that promote local seafood. These organizations should support branding efforts and customer accessibility. There are a few already in place, like Always NC Fresh, Carter Catch, NC Catch, just a couple of examples, but we should further develop these organizations. Another strong suggestion is establishing a western route of distribution. The supply chain is strongly linked between coastal communities, but not so much inland. This is already an existing market because North Carolinians who live inland are often the people who flock to the coast during holidays and the summertime. They live in an area of higher income, and if we could reach seafood to them throughout the year instead of just when they come to us in the summertime, this would be a great improvement to the industry. This has been lacking because there is a lack of refrigeration infrastructure across the state. So instituting cold storage distribution centers would help the supply chain flow across the entire state instead of just up and down the coast. If government representatives of seafood-oriented communities were supportive of this idea, it would be a great place to reallocate the funds used to support imported seafood. Tightening restrictions on imported seafood is also a step in the right direction. This would ensure safer products for consumers and alleviate the pressures of low-cost seafood in domestic markets. Action must also be taken to help fishermen maintain waterfront access and support. Tourism and development should be welcomed, being its stimulators for the local economy. However, we must keep in mind that fishermen also deserve their rightful allocation of the waterfront. In conclusion, the historical, cultural, and economic importance of North Carolina's seafood industry cannot be emphasized enough. It seems as if times are changing faster than fishermen can keep up with, and their survival is dependent on their ability to adapt and change. It's unfair that fishermen are in the position of defending themselves, but it's up to them to change the narrative. Each member of the seafood industry must bear the personal responsibility of spreading knowledge and insight about challenges facing the industry. If younger generations of seafood families could see that improvements are being made to the industry, they would feel more confident about following their family tradition. Thank you. If you have any questions, you can reach me at my email below.